Welcome, everyone. I would say it's lovely to see you, but it is lovely to know that you are there. I'm Alex Keller, the director of the Kahn Liberal Arts Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and moderate our discussion on democracy at the edge, a global consideration of the US election. This panel is a kind of early soft opening for the campus-wide annual theme next year on democracies. The small d and plural are very intentional. During 2021-2022, much of Smith's curriculum and co-curriculum and many events, performances, and exhibitions will coalesce around this theme. In spite of the seeming eons that have passed since last year, many will recall that we spent a lot of our focus as a college on the urgent matter of climate change in this very same way. It seemed to me that as the year unfolded, were we to follow it with a similarly urgent problem, it would be this one. Democracies and democratic ways of thinking have revealed themselves to be as fragile as they are robust. And that is true well beyond the United States. President McCartney gave us the all clear to have the Kahn serve as a hub of next year's theme. And that is what brings these particular four scholars together today, as I'll explain. For those of you who have never been here before, the Kahn Institute is Smith's experimental, creative, collaborative research sandbox. It's a place that faculty can try out new ideas with colleagues from other disciplines with different methodologies. Over the last 20 years, many faculty at Smith have incubated significant work at the Kahn. For students in the audience today, know that there are a few student fellows selected for each project each year, and that there is an open house next week you can attend that will tell you more. So check out our website for that info. One important way that the Kahn fosters those cutting edge conversations is in our 2-year-long projects, each built around a broad theme, organized by 2 faculty members from different disciplines and populated by fellows from across the arts and humanities, social sciences, and STEM fields, all making and sharing knowledge as they pursue individual and collaborative projects under that broad topic. Next academic year, our 2 projects, as well as all of the rest of our programming, will turn on this theme of democracies. Sujane Wu and Payal Banerjee have organized Democracies Redux, Resumptions, Resilience, Reconciliation, and Restoration. As Wu and Banerjee have described it, Redux is an invitation to open up what democracies might mean when reconsidered as ways of knowing and being that uphold interrelationships, inclusivity, and the work of restitution and renewal. How do we reinstate the kinship democracies have with cooperation, equity, and restorative justice, while living through crises including climate change, socioeconomic dispossession, and the swift, sweeping, violent change of life in and after the global pandemic? Andy Zimbalist and Steve Heydemann have organized Coping with Democratic Precarity and the Prospects for Democratic Renewal. As they suggest, democracy is faltering. At every level of governance and across multiple domains, democratic institutions, norms, and practices are under increasing strain. Anxiety about the fate of democracy is not new, yet the 21st century confronts it with challenges on a scale rarely seen in modern history, raising significant questions about the sustainability of democracy and how to nurture projects of democratic renewal. So, because all 4 of these scholars have been thinking about democracies and attached issues in this interdisciplinary way for some time, I wanted to take advantage of their expertise and focus in this moment. It is both the luxury and cost of being at this end of the American century that we tend to think about presidential elections in domestic terms, the global often coming a distant second. In the context of the pandemic and the fact that white America seems finally to be getting the memo about systemic racism, this might have been necessary to funnel us through the actual electoral process. But we need to zoom out again to global perspectives, and that is the purpose of today's discussion. A bit about each panelist before we dive in. Payal Banerjee is Associate Professor of Sociology. Her research focuses on globalization, migration, and the centrality of state policies in sculpting the structures of displacement and labor incorporation. In addition to teaching general classes in sociology, Banerjee offers courses on gender and global political economy, migration, social theory, and a first-year seminar on Bollywood and globalization. She is also affiliated with Smith's Study of Women and Gender program and the South Asia concentration. Steve Heydemann is the Janet Wright Ketcham 1953 Chair in Middle East Studies with a joint appointment in the Department of Government. Heydemann is a political scientist who specializes in the comparative politics and political economy of the Middle East. His interests include authoritarian governance and political and economic development, social policy, political and economic reform, and civil society. Sujane Wu is Professor of Chinese Language and Literature. She teaches courses on classical Chinese literature, culture, and all levels of Mandarin Chinese language. Wu's research focuses primarily on early medieval Chinese literature and culture in general, and poetry in particular, the relationship between word and image, music and poetry. She is also interested in issues in translating literary works from Chinese to English. Wu has been performing poetry, chanting, and singing for more than 3 decades. Andy Zimbalist is Robert A. Wood's Professor of Economics. He has consulted in Latin America for the United Nations Development Program, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and numerous companies. His many books start with Cuban political economy, controversies in Cubanology, and end, for now, with Rio 2016, Olympic myths, hard realities. He has consulted in the sports industry for players' associations, cities, companies, teams, and leagues. In the order in which I've just described this fabulous group, each will offer reflections for about 5 minutes. After that, the floor will be open, and I invite you to put your questions in the Q&A. If you'd like your question to be directed to a specific panelist, please say so. We will take questions largely in order, but we'll skip anyone who has already asked a question to make room for others. And if appropriate, I'll batch questions that are similar. So take it away, Payal.
You're muted.
Thank you, Alex, for that warm and generous introduction. I'm also very grateful to the Kahn Institute team for this event, and of course, very honored to participate in this panel with my esteemed colleagues. When Sujane and I sat down to conceptualize our project, Democracy's Redux, we emphasized the need to think of democracy beyond the ballot box and certainly not remain confined to November 2020, but consider democracies in relation to the many dates and decades, centuries even, on a transnational scale. Leading up to and since November last, we have moved through the pandemic's isolation, jarring inequities, solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course, anxieties about the election. Then we felt a wave of relief, for many at least, upon hearing the results, followed by more questions. Through this time, and now in conversations about what lies ahead, we have been told that America is divided, deeply polarized. Indeed, if we take the 100% mark as the whole and think of ballots in numerical terms, surely it seems that way, that the country is polarized. But I think that the use of the word polarized evades the persisting significance of race and racism and the intertwined gender sexuality hierarchies and ableism within race and racism. Black voters are not that divided. Latinx people and Asian Americans are not as uniformly divided as the word polarized might suggest. And queer people also would not neatly fall along the dividing line. So we must ask, what proxy does this deployment of this word polarized serve. The other buzz is about America being back. The cheer from Paris early on, we heard, was "Welcome back, America." Indeed, for progressives in Brazil, in India, Hungary, Ukraine, and elsewhere, the election results have brought hope, a hope for less active support for far right and right wing leaders, and hope for better human rights. Rest assured, Joe Biden has confirmed in a reply to all, America is back. Now, please take a 2-second pause and consider this. For many in this forum who may have any kind of ties to places like Nigeria, India, Kenya, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Jamaica, and beyond, this is like hearing the great Britain is back. You see, one needed to have left in the first place in order to stage a proper return. We continue to live in the colonial present, the grandchildren of colonial viceroys and military generals are now the loan officers or development experts at the World Bank, or are officers in NATO or US coalition led forces who give out 80 euros in ready cash as compensation for destroying fields of grain, think food, in Afghanistan. And so, in the context of empire, coloniality, and racism, to listen to activists in the Black Lives Matter movement intently and very carefully is to understand the inevitable commitment that Black lives need to matter, not just in the US, but globally. That Black lives matter in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia, and in Latin America. Brown folk, Asians, and indigenous lives need to matter worldwide. And for this to happen, the empire cannot keep coming back without any meaningful transformation, with only updated strategies of occupation, unequal exchange in trade, and extractive economies. The question then is, what would it take for a democratic transformation in which American democracy is not another name for a supremacist democracy in the form of an imperial state or an imperial coalition? And to sum up here, my third observation is as follows. This time around, our work as professors was also on the ballot. I heard angry criticism of critical race theory on news shows. This academic body of work, one of the most progressive ones, it seemed, was about to crash the gates of the White House. And I also saw quotations from the Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw's work, written in bold lettering on the placards used in racial justice rallies. My hope is that these words and activism will ensure that a different America is back. Until that happens, my refuge is my students, my colleagues, and indeed the humble course syllabus. I thank you for listening.
My thanks as well. That's a very, very difficult act to follow. That was extraordinarily eloquent. Let me join you in thanking Alex, thanking everyone associated with the Kahn Institute for having put this panel together, and my colleagues for giving me the chance as well to participate with them. I'm going to pick up on some of the issues that Payal introduced, but from a somewhat narrower cast, and yet animated, I think, by a somewhat similar set of concerns and questions. It seems pretty clear that among the reasons to look forward to the end of the Trump administration is the opportunity that it offers to undo some of the disastrous foreign policy initiatives that defined the international profile of the Trump administration. And one of the very first things targeted for change by the incoming Biden team is Trump's policy of embracing autocrats, including the very clear contempt that Trump himself demonstrated for the work of previous administrations engaging on issues of human rights, political reform, and democratization. I think it's fair to say that if we want to try to identify the sources of the deepening of democratic precarity around the world, we need look no further than the Trump White House. And the hope, of course, is that Biden, as he has indicated in some of his early statements, is determined to reverse this trend. Biden's Secretary of State designate, Tony Blinken, has already made comments critical of regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Both he and President-elect Biden have expressed criticism of Trump's deeply cynical, deeply transactional approach to foreign policy. And one of the questions following on this is whether Biden intends to elevate the promotion of democracy into a cornerstone of his foreign policy. This, in fact, is something that Obama himself never really did within his administration. He initially brought Michael McFaul into the White House as someone to oversee programs focusing on democratic change, but in fact, that was never a significant priority within his administration. And the question is whether Joe Biden will in fact invest that effort with more energy and more resources. We'll know a lot more about whether that's the case in the coming months, of course, but my sense is that there is in fact a better than even chance that we will see increased support for democracy promotion on some level under a Biden administration. And if that is true, if that turns out to be right, then the question we have to ask ourselves is whether that's a good thing or not. And Payal, I think, has given us many reasons to approach that question quite critically. I think, again, as welcome as it will be to see the end of the Trump administration, we have to acknowledge the possibility that renewed US support for democracy promotion comes with a number of very significant red flags attached. One is that in place of Trump's quite open and quite explicit embrace of autocrats, the Biden administration is simply going to revert to a more typical US posture, which is to talk the talk of human rights and democracy while continuing to do business with dictators. And I don't think we can discount the likelihood that that will, in fact, turn out to define a Biden administration approach to democracy promotion as more performative and rhetorical than substantive. But a second issue, and it's one that I focused on a bit in my own research, is that the U.S. will, in fact, engage in democracy promotion, but will do so badly, will do so ineffectively. Not because it doesn't really care, perhaps, but because how the US does democracy promotion rests on all kinds of thinking about how democratic change happens that turn out to be very deeply flawed. And I want to point in a very condensed way to three of these assumptions in particular, just to mention them here in the hope that we can have a fuller conversation about them during the Q&A component of our panel this afternoon. The first of these assumptions, and you can see this written across practitioner approaches to democracy promotion by the organizations that are principally responsible for this work in Washington, is a deeply, deeply Tocquevillian view of civil society as a carrier of democratic norms and values. When I think those of us who have paid attention to civil society and civic sectors understand very well that they can often be carriers of undemocratic norms and values, especially in authoritarian contexts. But as we've seen in the United States, there's been an awful lot of civic activism here as well that I think we would recognize as undemocratic and illiberal. The second of these assumptions is a commitment to what I would view as a liberal institutionalist conception of the state, such that projects intended to strengthen state institutions are believed to improve the quality of governance. And so we see an enormous emphasis in democracy promotion programming on improving the quality of governance by expanding the capacity of state institutions to do the jobs that they were created to carry out. And yet here too, we have seen far too often that one of the principal effects of strengthening state institutions can be to reinforce authoritarian norms and practices that regimes then deploy in decidedly undemocratic ways. The third assumption is the notion that strengthening private sectors and markets is an essential prerequisite for democratic change. Even though I think, again, those who have looked at the effect of neoliberal transformations in any number of countries targeted for democracy promotion programs can see that the notion that private sectors are somehow intrinsically pro-democracy turns out to have very little basis in fact. So if what we get from a Biden administration is a renewal of democracy promotion that is cut in the old mold, that reinforces or reintroduces the kind of tactics and strategies and rests on the kinds of assumptions that have guided democracy promotion programs in the past, my sense is that we have little reason to think that it will fare any better in the future under a Biden administration than it has under previous administrations. And so this leaves us with, I think, an important question. It leaves us with a real issue, which is for those who think that it would be a good thing for the US to take rights and democracy seriously, will the Biden administration be prepared to show first that it is willing to do more than talk the talk on these subjects and is prepared to make a much more substantive and focused and concerted effort to introduce issues of rights and democracy as factors that will shape the quality of America's relationship with governments that it finds deficient in those regards. And second, whether the US under a Biden administration would be open to rethinking how the US goes about supporting rights and democracy around the world so that it doesn't simply reproduce the flawed strategies of previous administrations. And I think I will leave it at that. And I very much look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Hi. I also want to thank everyone for making this event happen. It's going to be very difficult to follow my colleagues before me, but I will try, okay? So I'm now going to shift to a more personal level. After all, the political is personal. As a person who lives with literature and poetry, I would like to begin with a poem written by a female poet in the 9th century Tang Dynasty. Her name is Yu Xuanji, and the poem is translated here by Jia Jinghua, and the poem goes: my eyes are full of clouds and mountains when the spring sky clears up. How sharp the silver hook signatures produced from their fingers. I hate the God's gown which covers my verse, lifting my head, but in vain I envy the names on the list. You might wonder what a 9th century writer and her poem has to do with the US election. To me, I think Yu Xuanji, one of our foremothers, who resents the gender inequality that combines her political ambition and the literary talents, would be thrilled to hear the recent election outcomes, both in Taiwan and in the US. That is, Taiwan re-elected President Tsai Ing-wen in January, and the US has finally had their first female Vice President-elect, Kamala Harris, this November. The struggles faced by Yu Xuanji and many other women in the world have finally come with a hope and with a light. Nonetheless, we still have a lot to do and a long way to go. I'm not an expert on what counts as a formal international relations or politics. And besides, it doesn't really matter whether I like it or not. My life, just like everyone's life, is deeply impacted and shaped by politics. And each one of us just cannot escape from it. This is also my first time to think aloud and discuss my personal observations on politics in the public space here. And to be very honest with you, I feel very vulnerable in this public space, for I don't think I'm ready mentally and psychologically. Why, you might ask? For many people who live and grow up in a democratic society, they take freedom for granted. But for someone like me who grew up under Taiwan's martial law, would understand that freedom comes with a sacrifice, empathy, trust, and responsibility. These four principles tell us that freedom comes in a reciprocal relationship. This reciprocal relationship can be illustrated by the choice of wearing masks during this difficult time, meaning wearing masks becomes a part of embodying one's democratic duty. By choosing to wear masks, you choose or elect to protect others and yourself, even though on the surface, it seems that your personal freedom is compromised, but you know it is not. In recent US news, we have heard a lot about how Asian countries, South Korea and Taiwan in particular, have been so successful in controlling the virus and how the US could learn from their pandemic strategies. I do applaud Taiwan and Korea and South Korea's success and the mutual trust and empathy embodied by the government and citizens. However, I think we need to look at their success on a deeper political cultural level just as much, rather than just focus merely on the more surface level. In terms of strategies and logistics that these two countries have used. In other words, it is not merely about the motions of testing and the contact tracing. We need to understand that their political ethos of participatory citizenship expressed in a very specific way. Many in the US would assume that citizens in these two countries automatically and much willingly to wear masks because Asians are so used to be obedient to the government or are under authoritarian rule. At best, they did better this time because they have been through the experience of coping with SARS 18 years ago. I see it differently. People have elected to put on the mask in any public space during the most serious period of time because the core participatory values and the citizenship in action in these countries emphasize collective responsibility, empathy, mutual care, and trust. The democratic system in Asian countries do not overemphasize individual freedom. Instead, they emphasize that each individual's freedom is built upon the four principles, which sustain people's participation in the larger collective. Everyday actions or elections go beyond ballot box elections. To elect, to care for other people is indeed an expression of democratic action that we should all take. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about a Latin American perspective on these questions. Donald Trump got 45% of the Latin vote in Florida, up from 34% in 2016. This trend bodes poorly for future elections because Latins and Hispanics were 18.5% of the US population in 2019, and as the fastest growing group are projected to be 28.6% of the population in 2060. There are several reasons for Trump's success among Latins, but one of the prominent reasons was that Trump was very vocally anti-communist during the campaign. He did his best imitation of Joe McCarthy, ranting and raving about the ills of undemocratic and dictatorial communism in Venezuela and Cuba. Of course, Trump accused practically all his detractors of being communist. By any reasonable reckoning, it is clear that the repressive and reprehensible policies of Maduro's government in Venezuela have no more to do with communism than the brutal policies of Assad or Bolsonaro have to do with capitalism. The rising tide of repressive populist nationalism seen in the US, Brazil, Hungary, Turkey, and Russia is transpiring in capitalist economies. In addition to shutting down Latin American migration to the US and some window dressing on NAFTA, the other major Latin American policy initiative of the Trump government was a reversal of Obama's liberalization of relations with Cuba. Trump's policies not only sharply curtailed US travel to Cuba, but made it more expensive for shipping companies to carry goods to Cuba by excluding them from US ports and by steeply reducing the allowance for sending money remittances to the island. These and other embargo policies have been in place toward Cuba since 1960 and have had the explicit goal of overthrowing the Castro government, as acknowledged by Philip Bonsall, the US ambassador to Cuba in 1960. US aggression toward Cuba did not stop with the trade embargo. The US sponsored the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 and followed that with Operation Mongoose that laid the basis for the long-term strategy of destabilizing and toppling of the Castro government. All this after spending the 1950s cozying up to dictator and gambling mafia associate Fulgencio Batista. The US policy of overthrowing elected governments and supporting dictatorships in Latin America went well beyond Cuba. It included, among others, the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, the overthrow of Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic in 1963, and the subsequent invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965, the overthrow of Goulart in Brazil in 1964, the overthrow of Allende in Chile in 1973, and the overthrow of Isabella Perón in Argentina in 1976. Each of these coups was followed by the installation of a brutal military dictatorship supported by the United States. The US was also actively involved in supporting the overthrow of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in the 1980s by illegally selling arms to Iran in order to finance the war of the Contras against the left-leaning Nicaraguan government. Throughout this time, the United States was actively engaged in enforcing the embargo against Cuba and doing its best to make the embargo multilateral. The only breaks in this policy occurred for a few years during Carter and again under Obama when the strings of the embargo were loosened. Thus, the US embargo has failed year after year in its aim to overthrow the Cuban regime since 1960. One would think that the United States would get the message that the policy is not working and try to change it. This is what Obama started to do, but thanks to the Helms-Burton Act that Bill Clinton signed back in 1996, the embargo was codified and cannot be lifted without the approval of Congress. The rest of the world scoffs at the US inhumane and counterproductive policy toward Cuba. On November 7th, 2019, the UN voted 187-3 to condemn the US embargo of Cuba and declare it a violation of international law. This was the 28th consecutive year that the UN condemned the embargo by a near unanimous vote. Israel and Brazil were the only countries to vote with the United States against the resolution. Yet both Israel and Brazil continue to trade with Cuba. Biden will have a chance to return to Obama's rapprochement policy with Cuba, and whether or not he does, will send a very strong signal to the rest of Latin America and to the world. Biden has said he wants to end the isolationism and nationalism of Trump. He has also said he wants the US to resume a position of leadership in the world. US world leadership prior to Trump did not promote democracy except by coincidence. Instead, it promoted its geopolitical and economic interests. The United States and the world will be better off, and democracy's future will be less precarious if Biden strives for a policy of cooperation, not of leadership. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all of our wonderful panelists for doing a sort of mini con and producing these generous, capacious, interdisciplinary thoughts that link up in certain places and go in different directions in other places. And that is exactly what the con does. And it's exactly what I hope will help generate a kind of robust conversation for the rest of this hour. I encourage everybody to put questions into the Q&A, and I do have one, and I will start with this, and this is for everyone on the panel. And it is this: how can the Democratic Party truly support democracy in America, the need of which the panel has so eloquently underlined? What are the potential consequences if they fail? The losing candidate announced today that he may run again in 4 years. What new politics could help bridge the profound ideological gaps in the country? Go ahead, Steve.
I was about to jump in.
Well, it's a big question. And I'll say very briefly that, start with inequality and racism, but not at the expense of countries outside.
That was a brilliantly concise answer to a very big question. What I think about in imagining the possibilities for any kind of restoration of democracy under a Biden administration are the quite extraordinary obstacles that he has to contend with in making any sort of progress in that direction. We not only have to recognize the constraints that he will face from a very, very thin Democratic majority in the House to the introduction of any kind of legislative efforts that might respond to more progressive demands for more meaningful political change that are essential to a fundamental strengthening of democratic life in the United States. And we have to recognize that the Senate may well continue to be a quite extraordinary roadblock to any sort of progress on initiatives with that kind of a focus in the Biden administration. And one of the principal concerns that I think has already aired in quite a vocal and visible way is the nervousness and anxiety among progressives that Biden, partly in his recognition of the intensity of the obstacles that he confronts to the renewal and revitalization of real democratic life in America, and in his efforts to address the kind of just fundamental systemic issues that Payal mentioned, he will hew to the middle, that he will show himself to be the pragmatic, compromising, fundamentally centrist political figure that he was throughout his entire tenure in the Senate, and that in an effort to avoid the very tough struggles that he would need to be willing to invest political capital in, he will simply shelve many of the necessary reforms that are needed to ensure that the prospects for the successful return of the current loser to the political arena will be much weaker. And I think we saw, for example, I don't know if anyone in this audience read Charles Blow's column in the New York Times today, which was focused on Obama, but focused on the critical differences between activists and politicians. And he said, he described Obama as a wonderful politician, but as someone who is fundamentally unsympathetic to what it takes to be an activist. To the need to find the center, to build a broad coalition, to compromise around core values in order to make incremental progress, where activists, according to Blow, held much more firmly to the pursuit of political strategies and outcomes that would do far more ultimately to advance issues of justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, race, and so forth. And I'm afraid that what we have in Biden is a politician and someone who may come to view the activists within the Democratic ranks as a threat. And to me, that would represent a very, very important indicator of the limits of the extent to which we could look to his administration as a period where the opportunities for the revitalization of democracy are really meaningful. Now, of course, I offer that, as someone who studies the Middle East and has no more knowledge of American politics than anyone else on the screen tonight. But that at least is one way I think we can look at that question of Biden and democratic renewal.
So I would like to add that I think fundamentally there are lots of smaller issues and technical issues, but at the end of the day, if we want to have a richer democracy in this country, we have to have less inequality. It's going to be very hard for Biden to do very much in that area, I'm afraid. We've run up public debt right now that's larger than GDP, and it's growing at a rate of $3 or $4 trillion a year. Biden has appointed somebody to be his office of management and the budget, who has been in the past has been in favor of cutting Social Security and cutting Medicare. Those are things that have to be expanded. The other thing that needs to happen in this country, if we want to deal with inequality, because we can't just depend on Biden or any other leader to deal with it, is we have to have something happening from below. We have to have a reinvigoration of the union movement. And there has to be other popular movements that push the government and demand these improved conditions. I think in those regards, however much more sane the next 4 years is going to be, it's not going to, I don't believe, again, other than maybe distancing some of the new threats that Trump has posed, I don't think it's going to be a period of very deep democracy or democratization.
Sujane, do you want to add anything? All right, well, thank you all for that. I have another question, and it is this. How constraining both the Republican majority in the Senate and the infighting within the Democratic Party would be for realizing democratic aspirations here and abroad?
My own take. Hi, Ahmed. It's good to hear from you in the panel. My own take is that they pose very significant obstacles. I think it would be unfortunate to underestimate the degree of challenge that those two conditions present to efforts to revitalize democracy, precisely because we've already seen in the Senate the extent to which the majority is willing to go to impede any kind of policy initiative on the part of the incoming Biden administration. To the extent that there are already members who chair significant committees that would need to conduct confirmation hearings of appointees or designated appointed administration who say that they may not hold hearings, that they may simply refuse to pursue confirmation proceedings for some of the people that Biden would like to have in senior positions in his administration. And so I think we have to recognize that we face a Senate which, if the Republicans continue to hold the majority, will adopt a very, very polarizing obstructionist policy toward almost anything that the Biden administration might propose. And on the Democratic side, it seems to me that the positive response from the leadership in the House to concerns expressed by moderate Democratic members in swing districts, to the cost to the party of the embrace of positions advocated by members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others who want to move the party in a more progressive and what I view as a much more productive direction, is going to constitute another significant constraint. And looking at Biden again, my feeling is that he will always sort of tack to the middle, and that he will always be prepared to compromise in pursuit of small incremental gains of a more moderate form. And I think he will be looking to 2004 as well, and will be very deeply concerned about the potential effects on the future of the Democratic Party of some legislative successes that seem to confirm in the minds of many swing voters, independents, critical constituencies in the US that in fact the Democratic Party has moved further left than they're comfortable with. So I think the effects of preserving a Republican majority in the Senate and perhaps continuing or a longer term time horizon in which the Democrats have a very small majority in the House, I think those will turn out to be very, very significant obstacles.
I guess I just want to chip in here something that we haven't mentioned yet. I think it has to be mentioned, which is the environment. I'm hopeful that Biden will take a strong policy there and that he'll be able to pull over the line enough Republicans so that he'll get something done in that regard. And in terms of democracy, I think the best we can hope for is hold it at bay. But as we hold it at bay, let's hope we can save the earth.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that? All right. So the next question is, Mitch McConnell has so much power in making important decisions and has been reelected many times. Should the U.S. change some of its constitutional laws? If so, do you think it will be possible? And I would ask that when you're responding to this, because this is a very globally focused panel, that maybe there are some comparative examples, ways of thinking about this kind of stuckness in a constitution or other kind of government or governmentality that might be brought to bear here.
Is this going to fall to me? I've become the commentator on American politics on the panel. I don't know. Look, I think there are two principal in terms of constitutional changes, I think we have to recognize that amending the Constitution is an extraordinarily difficult task, and I don't think that's the pathway to pursue to bring about structural change in American politics that might improve the quality of democracy in the United States. I think there are at least three other possibilities, all of which I would hope would be actively explored. One, of course, is to extend statehood to the District of Columbia and to Puerto Rico. A second would be to expand the Supreme Court. So I think if the Biden administration finds itself not only confronting a very, very difficult circumstance legislatively in the Senate, if we have any possibility, if these two Georgia runoff races produce a razor-thin Senate margin that Kamala Harris could be the deciding vote on in many instances, I would like to think that there'd be some serious consideration of statehood for DC and Puerto Rico, and I'd like to think there'd be a much more serious conversation than Biden has signaled publicly he's prepared to participate in about the size of the Supreme Court. I worry very much that with the current composition of the court, any kind of meaningful legislative initiative that seems to threaten the status quo would face immediate pushback from this most conservative Supreme Court that we've had in probably 2 or 3 generations. But the likelihood of any of those changes, again, I think it would require a significant shift in how Biden approaches solving problems, how he approaches politics to envision them as meaningful possibilities. But I think they're there. And the other big change that has been discussed has been eliminating the filibuster, eliminating the 60 vote requirement for passage of legislation. I am a little bit more ambivalent about that because we've seen what happened when the filibuster was lifted on judicial appointments under Harry Reid when he was majority leader in the Senate. At the time, Mitch McConnell told him, "You'll live to regret this," and sure enough, I think we have lived to regret it. So without thinking about the Constitution as a mechanism for change, it seems to me that there are other possibilities available, And my colleague Alice Hurst in the Gov department, who knows a heck of a lot more about this than I do, has a really interesting comment in the chat on exactly that issue.
I think we do well to remember that this Constitution that we have is almost 250 years old. It was written by a group of white men who were most of them were very wealthy and land owning, and some of them were slave owning. And it's been written in a way that's pretty well insulated, and it's going to be very, very difficult to have a constitutional amendment. One of the movements that Steve didn't mention that I think has some promise is a movement amongst the states where states commit to give their electors to the winner of the national election. And if you can get 270 states, or 270 electors from enough states who make that commitment, then we'll have majority rule again, which I guess some people associate with democracy. And that would be a very, very interesting reform. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment, at least we don't think it does. And they're not that far away. So they're not there. There's a lot of work still to be done, but I think they've got somewhere over 230 electors now who are in states who are committed to that change.
Payal, you look like you're fixing to unmute. Okay, Sujane. All right.
I want to add something here. You know, for very good reasons, for excellent, brilliant reasons, the questions and answers are about the specificities of the processes, the laws, the systems, Constitution, Supreme Court, and all of that. And yes, indeed, we cannot underemphasize their importance. That said, the ways in which people think of themselves and their place in the country with the vote and so on and so forth is not merely a function of what happens within the national economy. The national economy is a part of the global economy, global political economy and geopolitics. So when people are thinking about jobs and medicine or healthcare, or all of that, right? What the US does in terms of trade, in terms of tariffs and exchanges, somebody in the questions mentioned foreign aid. You know, foreign aid is a simple term for something so complex that is tied up with the politics of development, loan repayment, interests, and years of countries in the global south being locked into geopolitical relations with the global north. None of that can be captured in conversations about electoral colleges, the Supreme Court, the judges' tenures, what's happening in the Senate or the House. So what I'm saying here is that as we think about these quintessentially American anchors to think about politics and elections and parties and bipartisanship, we cannot forget bread and butter, shelter, clothes, medicine, food, education, fundamentally a part of the global economy.
Well, Payal, since you mentioned that question, I think we should go to that and go further into that. And the question was this: beyond words, how important is money spent on foreign aid to support democracy? What is the most effective way to use aid to support democracies? Following on Andy's comments, is this likely to be a priority in the next 4 years? And I might want to add to that, is it likely to be a priority in the next 4 years? That's one thing, but then what would the four of you think if it were you making that decision?
I think historically, aid has been used by the United States and often other countries, not as much to promote development as it has been to open up markets to the private sector in those countries. And as such, it has not been a force to promote development. And certainly at the levels that the United States has been engaged with foreign aid, it can't have much of an effect one way or the other. The one area where foreign aid might be thought about, again, is going outside the United States, is the multilateral institutions like IMF and World Bank. Unfortunately, in my view, unfortunately, the United States has had pretty strong control over those institutions and has been quite selective, particularly via the IMF, in whom they'll give money to. And it's countries that follow regressive and austere economic policies that don't promote development at all and don't promote human welfare at all. So the paradigm of aid would have to change before I would have any optimism that was a useful vehicle.
I think I would tend to agree with that very much, but perhaps for some slightly different reasons. The level of funding for U.S. programs to support democratic reform, strengthening civil societies, and so on around the world is ridiculously small. I mean, the foreign assistance budget, broadly speaking, is a trivial component of the U.S. national budget, and that section of it, typically administered by the U.S. Agency for International Development, is a tiny fraction of that tiny fraction. And I think that's a very potent illustration of just how important a priority those efforts have been for the U.S. government. But on the other hand, to me, one of the principal dysfunctions that is structural to programs in support of democratic reform abroad is that these are all top-down, state-to-state initiatives in which, in many cases, the ways in which funding in support of democratic reform in authoritarian contexts is negotiated between the U.S. government and the governments that we're hoping to change. It's really quite a formula for failure, in my view. For example, in Egypt, there was a period after the 2011 uprising in which USAID staff had the temerity to make grants to independent civil society organizations without the prior approval of the Egyptian government. And it resulted in the temporary closure of the USAID office and the shutdown of those programs by the State Department in response to complaints from the Egyptian government. And so to me, one of the principal challenges that governments and international institutions, which are also state-based, by the way. I mean, the UN is a state-based institution. The World Bank is a state-based institution. One of the principal challenges that these kinds of institutions need to confront is how to deal effectively with non-state actors, how to bypass states, how to work around states, how to recognize when states are obstacles to the achievement of political reform, of social development that puts human security first, of efforts to address systemic inequality, of efforts to address systemic racism, exclusion, and marginality of disenfranchised communities. We need a system for the design and the delivery of assistance toward those ends that is capable of bypassing states, of bypassing political power. And asking a state-based institution, asking governments to take on that challenge and find ways to do that it is a very far-fetched proposition. And so for me, one of the principal concerns that we need to contend with in the years and decades ahead is how to build a global infrastructure for the delivery of this kind of knowledge and assistance and capacity that is not dominated by states. And I'm not entirely sure where that will come from, but to me, without it, we are largely doomed to reproduce the kind of failed strategies, failed tactics, top-down, hierarchic, rigid, state-driven programming that we've seen over the past 50 years.
I think we have time for one more question, because I know we are at the hour, and I want to keep it in we have many more questions we could go for, but I want to honor the global contours of this panel. So I'm going to end with this one, and that is: can the panelists suggest examples of other countries where democracy has been threatened by deep partisan divisions like what we have in the US now, but have been able to overcome those divisions and retain or strengthen democratic institutions, or even authoritarian regimes that have turned to democracy, and how?
Chile works in that. It fits the mold, maybe not in as short a time frame as the questioner is looking for, but I think many of you know that there was an elected socialist government in Chile from 1970 to 73, and it produced enormous internal divisions within the government coalition, which was a socialist coalition, and certainly between the government coalition and the right and center parties that existed. And it produced a dictatorship that was supported by the United States. That dictatorship was around for at least 20 years, but they put in a new constitution and allowed people to start voting in 1990. But it turned out the constitution they put in place had all sorts of constraints that enabled the military to continue to pretty much control decision-making. This year, 2020, last month, the Chilean people, after a year of very strong bottom-up rebellion, got the right to have a plebiscite to vote on having a new constitution. And if there was going to be a new constitution, would it be voted on by the existing parliament or by new people who would be elected to a new constitutional assembly? And the Chilean people voted 85% for a new constitution and 85% for a new constitutional assembly. So I think it's very encouraging. And to me, it suggests the importance of bottom-up mobilization and organization to promote democracy.
Well, when I saw James's question, it seemed to me we could organize an entire seminar around the breakdown of authoritarian regimes and transitions to democracy. And in fact, those are entire fields of study. The field of transitology, traces its origins back at least 40 years and has generated a literature that would more than fill the bookshelves behind Andy in that beautiful room there. But I think we can look at a number of examples that emerged out of what is often called the third wave of democracy, including Portugal and Spain, for example, in which countries that had experienced intense levels of social conflict and very deep levels of economic and social polarization, experienced civil war in the case of Spain, were able to put in place processes of transition that have produced durable democracies, and democracies that seem to have been able to withstand even today quite significant pressures from specific communities in Catalonia, for example, within Spain, to reshape the political bargains that were essential to the success of the democratic transition in 1974 and later in the 70s in Spain and in Portugal as well. So I think we have fortunately learned a lot of lessons about the processes that are more likely, about the conditions that seem to facilitate democratic transitions in formerly authoritarian regimes. We've learned a lot about the kinds of conditions and processes that contribute to the consolidation of democracies once that initial transition has occurred. But what's so disturbing is that the dominant trends of the past 20 years have in fact been the retreat of democracy and the expansion of authoritarianism within the international system. And I think if you look at any of the work done by the institutions that track these kinds of trends, like Freedom House, like I don't know, Freedom House comes to mind, we'll leave it at that. It is very, very disturbing to see the extent to which the democratization trends that defined global transformations in the period from 74 up to about 2000 have now been reversed, and for the past 15 years have been reversing almost every year without exception. And so we need to, I think, revisit this whole question of the conditions for democratic transformation and the conditions for transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, to try to understand what it is that has produced this backsliding as a global phenomenon. I think one of the principal causes is sort of the failure of democracies to respond to critical problems like systemic racism, systemic inequality, the collapse of social mobility, and all of these features of contemporary democratic life. But we do actually, fortunately, have a body of knowledge we can turn to in trying to think about how to respond to the challenges that we face in an environment where democracies, to draw from the title of our own project, seem far more precarious than we might like, and where authoritarian regimes seem to have a great deal more vitality and vigor.
Payal.
Yes, thank you. So the one thing I would add to this, and I think it's a critical thing, is that we're talking of countries as though they existed for centuries in the manner in which we see them today. The large number of free countries, nation states today, actually, in Asia and Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, they were coming out of as ancient civilizations, but modern new nation states from a very, very authoritarian regime, namely the Spanish colonies, the British colonies, the French colonies. So let us not forget that the free independent nation states across Africa and Asia established themselves as experimental democracies, if you will, that came out of a very specific template of authoritarianism. So that can be seen as phase one. Next, these countries were not, their shapes, their geographical expressions were determined by centuries of colonial occupation. So the populations that then are part of these countries are often, to begin with, homogeneous with vulnerable minorities in them. That then determines the kind of partisan politics and the kinds of democracy, authoritarian recalibrations that can happen. In this context, for example, coming out of British colonial authoritarian rule, India is cracked into two, and then East and West Pakistan into Pakistan and Bangladesh. So, we have seen this happen repeatedly, except our mainstream lens of authoritarian versus democracy cannot account for these historical contexts. Point number two. And number three, because of the post-colonial conditionality of these nation states coming out of colonial authoritarianism, these countries often have a majority Hindu population or a majority Muslim population. And these majority populations give consensus to further authoritarianize politics, right? So it's not necessary for a bipartisan rift to threaten democracy. It is quite enough for post-colonial homogeneity to lean onto identity politics, Hindu fundamentalism, to produce a kind of, on the template of democracy, right-wing populist politics that is completely democratically evolved, but has absolute authoritarian tendencies. So I think it's very important to remember when we say authoritarianism, which historical configuration we are talking about.
A very important point, Payal. Really, thanks for that. I think it's a really important point.
There are so many more questions, and there's so much in the chat, and that tells me that next year is going to be on fire. It's going to be a terrific year, and I'm just cannot wait. So I thank our remarkable panelists who have brought so much in such a short time, and it's really just the beginning. So I thank you all, and I thank everyone for coming. And thank you to everyone who has supported this event technologically and logistically. And I just am so excited for everything that comes next. So I wish you all a terrific evening and a great end to your semesters.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Panelists, great.